Friends, very good to have you join us, James. Nice to see you.
Very good to see you again too, Ian. Yeah.
James, where are we in the lectionary? We're tumbling towards the end of the lectionary year, are we not?
We are. It seems only only a month or two away. So Trinity 18 is where we're at.
Yep.
And the passage, the gospel reading is Matthew 21 and 33 to 46, which is following on from the piece that we did last week. It's
Yes,
the very next bit.
It is. Now, before we go any further, just a quick reminder for all our viewers of what we love them to do. We love them to
subscribe to the channel.
Well, you're doing a different order today, James.
Oh, I just keeping you on your toes. Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay.
Subscribe to the channel.
Subscribe, and at the end, there'll be a button to subscribe as well. Yes.
Yeah. Do like the videos if you like it. That really helps.
Now, what are you going to say next? You're keeping me on tenterhooks here.
Do comment on the
yes.
Comment. That would be fantastic.
Yep.
And do share on the social media. You can easily do that by just clicking the link below.
Click on the share button and then it gives you the link and then you can post that. So thank you. Oh gosh, how exciting. What a roller coaster of anticipation.
Yeah.
Okay, well, should we turn to our passage? Now, we'll just get plunged straight into this here. We don't want to keep people hanging around. I am very struck by the fact that this is following on, as you mentioned, from the passage from last week, which was the Jesus dealing with a conflict and, as a Jew, answering a question with another question, and very interactive style of engaging, isn't it? But then also teaching a parable. Last week we had the parable of the two sons, one who said, I will go and work in the vineyard, but I didn't. And then the other one who said, I won't go and work in the vineyard, then he did.
Yeah.
And of course, this passage follows straight on. I always think it must be very odd on a Sunday in a church when someone stands up to read and they start off by saying, hear another parable, and everyone's going, well, another one. Who's talking and what's the situation? And
that's what lectionaries do, isn't it? They slice and dice, and we get these non sequiturs on a Sunday morning. And I think often, I often think in church terms, we assume that everybody knows all the scriptures, don't we? By the way, we just dive in with a passage from 10 or 12 verses in the middle of a gospel.
Yes.
And it's actually quite demanding on a listener.
Yes, it is. But again, sorry to ride that hobby horse. Again, it's another reason why it's really good to have print Bibles in the pews in front of us.
Absolutely, because you can see you see the context within the scriptures.
Do you have print Bibles?
We do.
Yeah. Oh, okay, good. Yeah.
Both my churches have been, and we bought them for my last church as well. So it's a really important thing to do, actually.
I should say I have no interest here. I do not have shares in
we don't have any
publishing company. So so there we go. But the other thing again that struck me here is that again, I mentioned this last week. We have these intense chunks of Jesus teaching gathered together in Matthew, and yet we also have here, a lot of, if you're looking at a red letter version, a huge chunk of red letters here of Jesus' teaching. Although he is engaging, and I think there's more of this in Matthew than in the parallels in Mark and Luke. Now, I was interested just looking at different commentary. I've often mentioned Dick France's NICNT commentary on Matthew, which is really, really excellent. But also recently I've been using one in the Paideia series. One on Matthew is by Charles Talbot. And again, I found this really helpful in looking at issues around structure and shape as well as looking at context and too. And it's just really interesting. And I noticed in the blog article that Talbot says that this is the last of Matthew's 5 big cycles, and it consists of a narrative, which has been going since the beginning of 19, and then discourse with the block of teaching, and then the closing formula as well. And this is going to be a challenge for us this week. This one, this set of discourses, and then the block of teaching from chapter 24-25, he says is linked by the theme of judgment. Judgment on Israel's leaders, judgment on the temple, judgment on inauthentic disciples, and judgment on the nations. Judgment is both within history and at the end of history, which I think is going to provide us, and is providing anyone preaching on this, I think, some challenges this week. Some particular.
Definitely. I mean, and we live in a culture, don't we, that finds that idea of the judgment of God really difficult. So we're that's and also I think there's been one of the arguments people put forward is, if God is love, surely he must save everybody. There can't be any judgment. And actually, I don't think that's simply not sustainable by the kind of things that Jesus says in the Gospels. And But also the other contextual thing here is that we are heading towards the cross. And as you know, I think in all the Gospels, there's an elevation in the level of conflict,
Yes.
which Jesus engages in with the Jewish leaders and so on as we get to that point.
Yeah. Now, I also think there's around this whole question of judgment, there seems to be two particular elements that we need to pay attention to as we go through the text. I think they'll become clear. One is the way that in this conversation, in this sort of discussion about conflict, the way that the reality of judgment is teased out in Jesus' interaction with his opponents on the one hand. And I think we're also going to need to read really carefully on the question of what does, quote unquote, the judgment of Israel or the judgment of Israel leaders actually means, because we've got some unique phrases here in Matthew's account.
We have,
which heighten the challenge on the one hand, but actually paying close attention to exactly what he says, I think also helps us to find a way through that. Now, the other really interesting thing is that if we look at last week's parable and this week's parable, what is very striking, this is where the division of the lectionary perhaps is slightly unhelpful, but also the chapter division doesn't help as well, because this whole material runs all the way through. But it's striking that the shape of the parable of the two sons and the shape of the parable of the wicked tenants, as a wicked husbandman, as it's usually known, actually are very absolute run in parallel, don't they?
They do, yeah, including the sort of aside to the listeners from Jesus, the question aside to the listeners, asking them, well, what do you think?
What their view is,
you know, and he's drawing them into what is an inevitable conclusion. And you're sort of left thinking, well, did they realize it was about them when they gave that response or not?
So you have Jesus introduces it, then we have the parable, then we have Jesus' question inviting the response, and then the opponents do give a response. Then there's
but the response is generally self-condemnatory, which is extraordinary.
And again, that's very interesting that we notice that the parable of the two sons was unique to Matthew.
Yes. Whereas this one is in all three synoptics.
Yes, it is.
And has some significant overlap in terms of its features. I mean, they're quite well aligned in terms of the way the synoptics all tell it.
I think it's worth noting, and I think again Charles Talbot is quite good on this in his commentary as well, that he argues that this form of teaching of Jesus is, I think, what he calls a Haggadic midrash. In that you take a biblical text or a biblical idea, and of course we know what that idea is, don't we? It's the vineyard.
Yeah.
Sorry, I thought you were going.
Oh, I was going to say,
lobbing it up there for you to hit it out of the ground.
I mean, clearly, these parables of vineyards and owners and tenants are they're very much in the territory of Isaiah 5 and this profound understanding and this picture of a vineyard, which is the Lord's vineyard. It's the vineyard of Israel. It's
either unfruitful. It's unfruitfulness.
Well, some are fruitful, some unfruitful. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we always need to kind of have that lens on when we read that.
So you've got the parable here, building on taking an idea in the Old Testament, turned into a parable. Then followed with an engagement and some exposition. And then followed by drawing on a related scripture, one that's got a related idea, which isn't necessarily a text you'd put together. So we have that pattern. Now that strikes me as interesting for two reasons. One is, on the one hand, we keep seeing on the one hand that within Matthew we see a very Jewish Jesus. So it's no surprise that he was doing this Jewish way of doing it. But on the other hand, Mark and Luke record the same thing happening. So this Jewish Jesus in Matthew isn't Jewish out of a figment of Matthew's imagination. He's just being particularly faithful to this way of
it's how Jesus would have taught. It's how the people he was speaking to expected him to teach. So they understood the genre, they understood the rules of the game, as it were. And of course, what's particularly interesting here is the question, for me, I think, is, well, if you're going to teach like that, what is the text you're going to lay alongside the parable? Because in a sense, that's where the unique teaching of Jesus comes, isn't it? In that sense, I mean, lots of stories, lots of parables being secular, but it's the laying alongside that text on this parable that I think is particularly interesting. Yeah.
So let's look into some of the details.
Yeah, let's dive in,
shall we? Now, here we have again another, not just a structural but a linguistic parallel with previous teaching, which is there was a master of a house.
Yes, this word oikodespotes, which we came up a couple of weeks ago when we looked at Matthew 20 and the parable of the workers in the vineyard. And I think, I mean, it's quite interesting. I think it's particularly interesting. We noted then that halfway through that parable, the owner is then described as the Lord of the vineyard, which is a phrase.
When you say we noted it, you're being very modest, James. You noted it.
Well, I noted it, but a phrase resonant with for this context of it being Israel. And once again, this parable does exactly the same. So you get that shift to the Lord of the vineyard, or I think probably some say the master of the vineyard, but that's the phrase that is shifted to. So
it is disguised. I'm looking at the ESV. It says verse 40. Therefore, the owner of the vineyard. Now, just again, as we noted before, the King James version, the authorized version, actually is more faithful word for word. When the Lord, therefore, of the vineyard cometh. So
yeah.
So but that's also worth noting, by the way, if you don't feel confident reading Greek, if your Greek isn't very good, or you don't have a Greek text to hand, always worth reading passages in a range of different translations.
Because
it does give you a window into potentially what's going on here. I was quite struck by the fact that I don't think I actually comment on this in the blog post, but the details here that he planted a vineyard and put a fence around it, dug a wine press and put a tower in it. These are actually very strong allusions to Isaiah 5.
They are.
So there's no mistaking the Old Testament allusion.
No, I think it's kind of brutal, really. It's brutal and ruthless of Jesus to have that level of allusion. So that there could be no doubt about what he was talking about. I suppose one of the questions that people sometimes ask is there a significance to those, to the things like the fence and the wine press and the tower, or are they just there because they indicate that this is about Israel?
This is what you would do in the ancient world if you had a vineyard.
You put a fence right, but is a fence in relation to Israel indicative of anything? And I think most commentators don't think that is particularly important.
But the elements have some significance. I mean, I think the wine press has sort of a bit of a looming significance. I think for me, because I'm aware from reading Revelation, I had to get that in there. Well, in Revelation chapter 14, you have two scenes of judgment in parallel. One is about, I mean, these are two images from the Old Testament. One illustration of, well, one metaphor for judgment is the harvesting of the grain. Hence, Pentecost happens at the
grain harvest,
the first fruits. And we and of course Paul used that language. The Spirit is the first fruits for us, and that's all to do with the harvest there. But then you have the other image of judgment in Revelation 14, which is the wine press. Again, particularly in the Old Testament. So the harvest of the wheat is an image of judgment, which is a positive one because it's harvesting, as it were, the righteous into the kingdom. And the negative image of judgment is the wine press because the grapes are then trampled. And in Hebrew, the juice that comes of the grape is called the blood of the grape.
And of course that's echoed in that song. He's trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored, isn't it? So
if you know that song, it is.
You
want to sing? No, you don't want to sing.
No, I'm not going to sing.
Okay,
definitely not.
That is, and that is interesting, isn't it? Because a lot of traditional hymnody does go into quite some depth about these biblical images.
They do, they really do, because of course they naturally provide poetic material.
So anyway, the phrase I'm really, really intrigued about is this one, and he does all this, and then he went into another country.
Where's that country?
Well, it's just interesting. It's the idea, or it's the recognition, and this again has connections with eschatology and judgment and so on. The recognition that there's in some sense in which God is distant for the moment, but that one day he will return. Now, I'm reminded straight away of Aslan and of the Emperor from across the sea in the Narnia Chronicles. This is an idea that there's a sense in which God is present in some sense, but also in some sense is not yet present.
Yeah.
And of course, all through the New Testament, the language of Jesus's return is parousia. Now, parousia literally means presence.
Yes.
I mean, it doesn't mean coming, it means presence. What it means is the royal presence of the king who has been away across the sea.
Yes. Yes. So, and I mean, he can't be far, in a sense, he's not totally distant. Can't be that far away. Otherwise he wouldn't be able to send his slaves. He's got to be able to instruct his slaves.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of both and in this, I think.
Yeah. And again, the next phrase in verse 34, it seems to me to be so pregnant with meaning, which is that the season of fruit drew near.
Yeah.
Now, again, we can't escape the fact that this is kind of language of judgment or reckoning.
Yeah.
Now, as a gardener, I know that very well, that you do all sorts of things. You sow things and you look after them, you water them and so on. And then it comes a point where you're expecting a harvest.
Yes. You spend a lot of time getting ready for that. So you have a huge investment in it, don't you?
Yeah. And then we've got all this language. Now, this is interesting because Matthew here actually, I think, goes into more detail about this sequence of servants. I think this is an unusual point where Mark abbreviates a little bit.
Yes, because he beats and kills and stones, and he likes threes in this parable, Matthew. It's quite interesting because he has that, beats, kills, stones, and then he has 3 waves of he has the 2 waves of slaves and then his son, so he has 3 waves of sending, which is interesting.
Yeah, we have noticed that before, though. We've noticed that Matthew likes his numbers, or likes to be faithful to the numbers that Jesus
use, and of course there's a rhetorical usefulness in that.
There is in
oral memory and so on.
And in chapter 25, in the parable of the sheep and the goats, the things that have or have not been done to the least of these my brethren come as 3. There's 6 items, which are 3 pairs.
Okay, right.
There's food and drink, and there's stranger and naked, and there's sick and in prison. So. Yeah. Now, again, there's another really interesting thing here where the accounts run in parallel in Matthew and Mark and Luke until we get to the treatment of the son. There's a very fascinating tweak in the order here in Matthew.
Yeah, absolutely. So in Matthew, they say, "Let us kill him." He's killed and then thrown out, isn't he?
Take him and they threw him out and then they kill him.
Yes. Yeah.
Whereas in Mark and Luke,
they
take him and kill him and throw him out.
Yeah. And when you think of those in terms of Jesus, I mean, and the one who was crucified outside the city, Matthew's chimes in with that much more closely, doesn't it? So in the sense, it emphasizes very clearly for us who this is about. Yeah.
One interesting question here people have raised with me in thinking about this parable is, where's this stuff coming from? Is it really true that the prophets, because elsewhere Jesus says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you've stoned the prophets, and later on in the later judgment material. It isn't actually in the narrative of the Old Testament a prominent theme. It is. I mean, in the blog I mentioned 2 Chronicles 24. There's an example.
Oh, yes.
And in Hebrews 11, there's discussion about this as well. And Jesus referred to it in Matthew chapter 5 in the Sermon on the Mount as well. So, but it's almost as if it's something kind of proverbial, not proverbial, that this is how when the leadership of Israel goes wrong, this is what they do to the prophets. They reject them and they stone them and so on.
Yes, it's an indicator of the problem. They're not listening to the voice of the Lord. And I suppose I'm also thinking strong overtones of Ezekiel's understanding of the prophetic mission, as it were, and what the people of Israel will do in relation to that, and who's responsible and so on.
And then we get to this incredibly interesting sort of flex in the narrative, isn't it? Because you might expect Jesus to say, well, look what's happened, and then this, and he does in other parables, and then this is what the householder, Lord of the Vineyard, this is what he does. But he doesn't do that.
No. He asks them what will happen. He asks them to pronounce the judgment, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does. Now, this is interesting. I think for me, this also ties in with something quite interesting we find in our culture. At the very beginning, you said, well, we don't like the idea of God as judge. But it's not quite as simple as that, because it seems
No.
to me that in our culture we do love judgment.
I know, there's deep irony, isn't it? Deep irony.
There's an appetite for justice and for judgment.
Yeah, and actually an appetite for judgment and that is not based on anything rational very often.
No, there's a deep sort of
Mm.
yeah. We've got Russell Brand at the news at the moment, haven't we?
Yeah,
And a sense of, well, he's clearly guilty,
yeah.
and no reasonable person can desire anything other than he is made a pariah and excluded forever from our screens and any influence and so on. Now, I'm not making a judgment about whether he's right or wrong or what should be done, but it is interesting how there's that deep instinct. I can't remember if I've mentioned this to you before, but I was on the first Springboard mission way back in the 1990s.
Oh wow, yes.
Decade of evangelism.
Yes.
With Michael Green.
Yeah.
And I can't remember if he told the story or somebody told the story about him, but when he was an enthusiastic student and he went to a hostile meeting in the London School of Economics, LSE, in these 1960s rabid, rebellious atheists. And apparently he went up on the stage and said, "Why are you lot so revolting?" And they went, "Oh." What he was asking is, why are you revolting? Why are you rebelling against what you see as the injustice of the world around you? In other words, where do you get this deep sense of the need for justice?
Yeah.
Which is, and if we lived in a material world, you would say, well, there's no, we do have this deep sense.
We do, yeah, absolutely.
Of a need for justice.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, the other thing that we perhaps just glossed over here is but to which the leaders are responding is the fact that it is really a massive surprise in this parable that the owner sends his son. I mean, without any protection. I mean, he doesn't send him with a bunch of armed. No, and I mean, I find that extraordinary. There's this. He must know what is going to happen to the son. He does know what's going to happen because it's happened to the slaves. I know he says to himself, which is an interesting kind of internal reflection, they will respect my son. But actually, of course, we know that's not the case. So it's a big surprise, really, I think, sending the son. I don't know how you feel about that, Ian, but it does come out of the blue a bit, doesn't it? Well,
yes, it does, doesn't it? I don't know. I honestly haven't reflected on that.
No. Well, yeah.
It is though the characteristic that often in these parables, often in the economic parables, that the key character has this internal reflection, which is central to the thing.
Yes, I'm absolutely.
Let me do this. If I do this, then this will happen. It'll be sorted out.
Yes. But I think in the leaders are particularly responding to this surprise because they're saying, "Oh, well, I mean, this is the owner's son, so of course he's going to respond very violently and terminally, as it were, to what's happened to his son." I mean, why wouldn't you?
But again, the fascinating Jesus's use of drawing out their response. So he sets the scenario up, and of course, the obvious thing to do is this. And of course, the punch of the story then is, well, okay, let's translate into real life. Who am I?
Yeah.
Who are you in relation to this parable? So there is a sense in which it's if it was written, it would be like they're not reading the parable is reading them, or they're not hearing, listening to the parable. It's who the parable is actually speaking to them and about them. I think there's something interesting which you've observed to me before, which is that the response of Jesus' opponents is actually fairly hopeless.
Yeah.
Whereas Jesus' response, drawing on Psalm 118, is actually much more hopeful. And I think that's really important in terms of thinking about judgment in that context of the leaders of Israel.
Yeah.
Tell me a bit more about your observation there.
Well, I was just thinking about, the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it's amazing in our eyes.
Yeah.
Is an extraordinarily positive text of God drawing out something amazingly wonderful from something that ostensibly looks
really terrible,
like a disaster. Mm-hmm. So I hear sort of rich hope in that. And it's interesting that Jesus doesn't comment on the leader's analysis of the parable in response to his question. He doesn't say, yeah, of course that's what's going to happen. He actually moves to this text of hope. So that's I think it's worth emphasizing that, actually.
And it's a significant text in the New Testament. I mean, Peter draws on it as well.
Absolutely. So it was clearly it's a messianic text for Jesus. I mean, I suspect I don't know how it was interpreted before Jesus, but he certainly interprets it in that way, doesn't he?
Yeah. But this is also really significant in terms of, again, thinking about judgment and how not to use this text anti-Semitically, if I can put it like that.
Yeah, yeah.
In the sense that because this stone that's rejected has become the cornerstone, there's a sense in which, and again, this is how Peter uses it. 1 Peter uses it. It's just that, well, what do you do with a cornerstone? Answer is you build a new edifice around it.
Yeah.
And again, the fascinating thing, of course, is that they're standing in Jerusalem. And if you can go today and you can see this huge cornerstone, which I think weighs something like 400 tons, you can still see it's there in place, even though most of the rest of the walls have fallen down.
Yeah.
And you can stand by it. It is quite
extraordinary. It's quite extraordinary. Yeah. Enormous.
It is.
Yeah.
And then you see, you get into this phrase, therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing its fruit, which has, I mean, this, oh my goodness, there's so much to talk about just in that verse. Now, interestingly, you can't read this in a supersessionist way, in the sense that it doesn't say it'll be taken away from you, the Jews, and given to the nations, the Gentiles.
No.
There isn't that kind of replacement going on. The word is singular to a nation or a people, an ethne, an ethnic group. Actually, ESV translates it as nation. I know one of the versions translates it as nation.
I think they do. Yeah,
but it's not nation. It's a people.
It's a people. It's the word ethne. So it's absolutely. And that people, of course, are the people of the kingdom. And that can be a Jew, it can be a Gentile. Yeah. It's whoever accepts the Son as the cornerstone.
Yes. Yes. And we're seeing all through Matthew, we're seeing that this shift in focus from the Israel of God defined around obedience to Torah to the Israel of God defined around response to Jesus and his proclamation of the kingdom. And of course, in most of the gospel, that is a subgroup within Judaism.
Yeah. So
it's those Jews who follow Jesus, the Jewish Messiah.
Yeah. But also, I mean, there's the other perspective on this is Matthew's first readers, his first hearers of this text, isn't it? So, that's important to just reflect on how they would have heard it too.
Yeah. And Charles Talbot makes quite a challenging comment. He says that actually within that community, Matthew's language, he says, while seeming to be directed to non-messianic opponents, is really aimed at insiders within the Matthean community. The evangelist is using a technique of covert allusion, a warning for the church, the ecclesia, those gathered around the person of Jesus, that its members must not be like the scribes and Pharisees, for if God did not spare Jerusalem, God will certainly not spare an unfaithful church.
Yeah.
But there's a continuing challenge there because, of course, again, characteristically of this gospel, it's about producing fruit.
Yeah.
Which doesn't mean being nice to people. It means being obedient. This is exactly what we heard from John the Baptist right at the very beginning, didn't it?
Yeah.
Producing the fruit of repentance, that living the new life of obedience to God, having turned to him for grace and forgiveness. And of course, we would now say receiving the Spirit. Yeah,
and fruits are really Matthew really likes the word fruit. He uses it more often than the other synoptics, interestingly. And of course, it's a word used in that sense, but also in the sense of bringing others to faith in the Messiah, in Jesus. So you have the parable of the sower and so on. So I think
fruit produces seeds. When you sow seeds, they produce more.
Exactly, more fruit. So and that the original idea of being fruitful and multiply, is here translated into the language of the kingdom, which is to produce people of the kingdom. So that's I think that's there in the idea too.
Just another final note on numbers. This is the 5th of 5 occasions where Jesus in Matthew says the kingdom of God rather than the kingdom of the heavens.
Yes.
Folks, if you think there's any significance to that in this particular poem, do put it in the comments. I did in the previous week's thing. I did actually count up the 5. And
I seem to remember you doing that. Yeah.
So. Wow, James, we've got to the end of our time, but my goodness me, there's lots of stuff in there, lots to think about, lots to process and sift in reading this passage and preparing for preaching. So, folks, if you've got particular insights, do put them in the comments. Do give us a like, thumbs up. That's great. Do pass it on and share and subscribe to the channel. We look forward to seeing you next time. James, thank you very much. Look forward to seeing you next time too. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.